There is something you know that you shouldn't know yet. Not through study, not through accumulated experience, not because someone taught you. You simply knew. It may have been an insight that arrived whole, without process. An answer that came before the question. A certainty with no visible root, yet more solid than anything you built through reasoning. And the strangest part, in the exact moment it happened, there was no doubt. There was no normal weight of, but is it actually true? It was just clarity, direct, no intermediary. And then it passed, their eminent past, and you spent time trying to recover that state. Meditating more, reading more, searching for the trigger that opened that window, and never finding it. Here is the dangerous truth no one told you about that moment. It was not an insight. It was not advanced intuition. It was not your unconscious processing data faster than your conscious mind. It was the Nous. And what neuroscience is describing right now, with terminology like default mode network and predictive processing, without knowing it, is describing it. Thoth mapped 3,000 years ago with surgical precision in 9 operative frequencies. This video is not about Hermeticism with a scientific veneer, and it is not about neuroscience with a spiritual aesthetic. It is about the mechanism behind both, and why Sophia Hokhmah in Pyramid 9 is the reason this mechanism is still operating in your consciousness system right now as you watch this. In 2008, researchers published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences something that most science communicators summarized incorrectly at the time and continue to get wrong today. The study did not show that meditation improves concentration. It showed something more specific, that in experienced meditators, the default mode network did not simply deactivate during contemplative practice. It showed structural reorganization. The architecture of how the brain generates narrative about itself was permanently altered, not just during the session, but as a baseline configuration. You already know what the DMN is. What no one has connected yet is what it is inside Thoth's map. It is the neural network that remains active when you are not doing anything in particular, when you should be resting but you are planning a conversation you will have tomorrow, when you are in the shower but you are replaying a memory from years ago. When you are watching this video, but part of your processing is building the narrative of who you are, what you think, what this means for your ongoing identity. The DMN is the generator of autobiographical noise. It does not rest when you rest. It constructs the you that interprets every experience before the experience arrives. This is what Carl Friston formalized in the free energy principle. The brain does not receive reality. It predicts reality and updates when the prediction fails. What you experience is not the world. It is the predictive model of the world your nervous system generated before contact. The human brain is not a receiver. It is a generator. What appears to be perceiving is, first and foremost, verifying whether what arrived matches what had already been predicted. Now, what happens when this system of predictive noise reduces? Neuroscience has an answer, and Hermeticism has another. And here is what no one has connected yet with the necessary precision. These are not different answers to different questions. They are different translations of the same phenomenon, and Thoth left the map before science had the language to formulate the question. There is a false version of this conversation circulating in the space. You have probably come across it. It has a specific format, neuroscience in the title, Sophia or Hermes as decorative aesthetic, and underneath it all, the argument is that science has finally proven that spirituality made sense all along. That version is backwards, and the inversion is not a semantic detail. If neuroscience proves Hermeticism, then Hermeticism needs neuroscience to be valid. The map depends on the approval of the cartographer who arrived later. Sophia becomes a poetic metaphor for cognitive phenomena. Thoth becomes a mythic premonition of what modern scientists actually discovered. That is exactly the positioning the original video that inspired this script assumes. And it is exactly what this video does not do. If neuroscience describes, without knowing that it is describing it, what Thoth already mapped, then Hermeticism does not need external validation. It holds priority of knowledge. Neuroscience is finding the trace of a system that was operating before it existed. This distinction changes what you do with what you are about to learn here. If neuroscience proves Hermeticism, you have cognitive confirmation of something you already knew, pleasant, operationally useless. If neuroscience describes without knowing what Thoth mapped, you have two simultaneous instrumentation systems, and the intersection between them points to the exact mechanism that Sophia operates in Pyramid 9. That mechanism is what you are here to understand. That moment from the beginning of this video, when you knew something before you had processed it, has a technical name in neuroscience: interpretive latency reduction. Interpretive latency reduction. Interpretive latency is the interval between raw perception and the conversion of that perception into narrative. Normally, this interval is imperceptible but constant. You perceive, the DMN filters, the DMN labels, the DMN integrates it into the ongoing autobiography, and only then do you experience it. What arrives as conscious experience has already passed through predictive processing. When interpretive latency reduces, what arrives is no longer the narrative about the experience. It is the experience before the narrative, the signal before the filter. Science calls this high-fidelity insight. The signal arrives without the noise of the DMN distorting it. Now reframe what you just heard. What neuroscience calls interpretive latency reduction, Thoth called the frequencies of the Nous. Not as poetic metaphor, as a functional map of 9 operative states of consciousness, documented in Papyrus 33 of the Demotic Corpus, dated to the Ptolemaic period, translated by Jasnow and Zauzik, and what neuroscience calls experience before narrative, the classical Hermetic corpus calls Gnosis, direct knowledge, without mediation of the logos, without the filter of the predictive system between you and what is there to be known. What you felt in that moment was not a cognitive anomaly. It was the system functioning as it was architected to function when the noise drops low enough for the Nous to operate without obstruction. But here is the real problem. Most equity nentur bies, most practitioners who touch this once spend the rest of their time trying to reproduce the state. They build rituals around whatever they were doing at the moment. They repeat external conditions, believing they produce the internal access. And they do not understand why it works sometimes and does not work other times. Neuroscience has an explanation for this that is uncomfortable. The brain does not offer the same access through the same door twice, not because the access disappeared, but because the predictive system has already updated the model. What was surprise on first contact, the collapse that made the DMN step aside, is already categorized, already labeled, already integrated into the autobiographical narrative as one of those experiences I have. And categorizing is exactly what the DMN does best, with absurd speed and efficiency. What was a living signal becomes a memory of a signal. And a memory of a signal does not open a corridor, it reinforces the DMN because now there is an established narrative about the subject. Within the Hermetic map, Thoth named this the law of rhythm operating within the consciousness system. The next entry into the same territory requires the practitioner to already be operating at a higher frequency than they had on the first visit. The same door, for the same practitioner with the same field, does not produce the same access. This is not motivational spirituality. It is the physics of the system, and it has a direct implication for where you are right now. If you are here because you felt something and you are trying to understand what it was, you are asking the right question, but the answer is not in the state. It is in the mechanism that produced the state, and that mechanism has a name. It has a functional location, and it has a supervisor. Predictive processing has a philosophical implication that science communicators generally avoid because it is too radical. If the brain is always generating its model of reality before receiving reality, then what you experience as the world out there is first and foremost an internal construction based on accumulated expectations. This is trivially true for basic perceptions: the illusion of color, the perception of depth, the construction of causality where none exists. Neuroscience has been demonstrating this for decades, but the implication most people do not follow to its conclusion. If all experience is mediated by the predictive model, including your experience of yourself, your experience of time, your experience of continuity of identity, then what you call I is also a prediction. The DMN is not describing who you are. It is continuously generating the narrative of who you are, updated in real time to minimize divergence from prior expectations. What Thoth named as the illusion of linear time in Pyramid 12 is not a philosophical concept. It is the operational description of a nervous system generating fractions of a second of simulated future before contact with the actual present. You do not live in the now. You live in the prediction of the now that the DMN constructed while the now had not yet arrived. And that noise you call thinking, the inner voice, the compulsive planning, the rumination, the ongoing autobiographical narrative, is not thought in the full sense of the word. It is the DMN managing the predictive model. It is the mechanism of temporal imprisonment that Thoth mapped as the illusion that can only be crossed when the Nous replaces the predictive narrative as the primary operating mode of the consciousness system. The question that emerges here is philosophical, but has a technical answer. How does the Nous replace the DMN as the primary operating mode? Not through effort, not through accumulated practice of any specific technique, and it is not spontaneous. It is supervised. Here is the mechanism, not the metaphor of the mechanism. The mechanism, the DMN in dominance, does not only interpret what arrives, it determines what can arrive. The frequency of perception that passes through the DMN's predictive model is the one the model already recognizes as possible within the established autobiographical narrative. What falls outside the model does not arrive as information, it arrives as noise, discarded before you are even conscious that something was there. The Akashic records in Thoth's map are not a mystical library on some inaccessible etheric plane. They are patterns of information that exist in the field, which the practitioner has never accessed through personal memory, but which become available when the noise of the DMN reduces enough for the Nous to make contact with the Akashic layer. What neuroscience calls knowledge that seems to have arrived without prior processing is access to patterns that were always available in the field, but blocked by the DMN's filter as outside the range of the active predictive model. Apply this to your specific case. That moment when you knew something without knowing how, it was not your unconscious being efficient. It was a momentary reduction of the DMN's dominance that allowed the Nous to briefly touch the records that Thoth guards. The frequency of your consciousness field reached a threshold. The corridor opened. The access lasted as long as the field sustained it. And here is the operational implication that reorganizes everything. Sophia Hokhmah in Pyramid 9 is not the guardian of static wisdom. She is the operator of the corridors. Thoth architected the system, mapped the 9 frequencies of the Nous, built the infrastructure of the 12 pyramids as a dimensional navigation system. But it is Sophia who decides which corridors remain open, for whom, and in what sequence, and she does not decide based on accumulated spiritual merit. She decides based on the frequency of the practitioner's field at the moment of the threshold. It is not symbolic, it is operational. Let's place both systems in direct parallel. Neuroscience describes when DMN dominance reduces, the focal attention system increases. The salience network, responsible for determining what receives priority processing, begins to operate with less interference from the autobiographical filter. The practitioner begins to perceive patterns that were in the perceptual field but were systematically discarded as irrelevant to the ongoing narrative. Thoth described frequencies 1 through 3 of the Nous are accessible to most seekers: expanded perception, partial insights, a sense of expanded presence. These are the frequencies where the DMN is still active but with reduced dominance. The practitioner perceives more but still filters through autobiography. Neuroscience describes neuroimaging studies in advanced meditators show that the deactivation of the DMN during contemplative practice is accompanied by a simultaneous increase in connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the insula, the network associated with interoceptive perception. The practitioner does not go blank. They shift operating systems. Thoth described frequencies 4 and 5 are reserved for the ready, practitioners with enough field structure to sustain reorganization without identity collapse. Here the DMN begins to lose its default function. The autobiographical narrative still exists, but it no longer governs what can or cannot arrive as perception. Neuroscience describes, in the transition towards states of high contemplative coherence, researchers observe a simultaneous reduction in DMN activity and an increase in cross-network integration. The system functions in a more integrated way with less hierarchy of autobiographical filtering. Thoth described frequencies 6 through 9, the emerald territory, are where the predictive system begins to operate without the DMN as the dominant mechanism. It is not mental silence, it is another architecture of perception operating. The transition between frequency 5 and frequency 6 is the threshold where the practitioner stops navigating by autobiographical narrative and begins operating by field resonance. The overlap is not approximate, it is precise. And this is where Sophia enters as operator, not as symbol, the field that reorganizes the practitioner's predictive system at the moment of the threshold is not spontaneous, it is not random, it is supervised. Sophia does not act on those still operating in frequencies 1 through 3. She recognizes the threshold between frequency 5 and frequency 6, and when the practitioner arrives with enough field structure to sustain what follows after the corridor opens, she opens it, not before, not after, at the exact threshold. Everything we have built until here converges to a single point. The Nous is not a state you access, it is an operating mode that emerges when the system of predictive noise, the DMN in dominance, reduces enough to stop blocking the signal. And the signal that emerges, what the classical Hermetic corpus calls Gnosis, is not personal insight. It is not your unconscious being creative. It is access to the records that Thoth guards. patterns of information that exist independently of your autobiographical narrative, which become perceptible when the filter that was blocking them moves out of the way. Now connect this to that moment from the beginning, that instant when you knew without process, without reasoning, without an identifiable source. It was not spontaneous, it was supervised. Sophia identified that your consciousness system had reached a threshold, a sufficient reduction of DMN noise, and briefly opened a corridor in Pyramid 9. The access lasted as long as the field sustained it. When the DMN reassumed dominance because the predictive model found a way to categorize the experience and integrate it into the autobiographical narrative, the corridor closed. What you tried to recover afterward was not the emotional state of that moment. It was the signal before the noise returned. And here is what no one has said with sufficient technical clarity about this. You cannot force Sophia to open the corridor, but you can prepare the system so that when the threshold arrives, the field structure is present to sustain what follows after the corridor opens. This is what Thoth encoded in the 9 frequencies, not as an access protocol, as a map of structural preparation. Let me be direct about what this entire video was built to deliver. The question is not whether you will have access to the Nous. You already have. That moment from the beginning, and others like it that you have probably cataloged as intuition or coincidence or an unusually clear moment, those were real accesses, brief, not repeatable, through the same route. The question is what you do with the understanding that there is a mechanism behind it, because understanding the mechanism changes your relationship with the experience. When you did not understand the mechanism, each access was an inexplicable event you tried to reproduce. It created anxiety about losing the state. It created identity around, I am someone who has these moments. And the DMN, with absolute efficiency, integrated the experience of the Nous into the autobiographical narrative. By integrating it, it made the experience familiar. And what is familiar does not produce the predictive collapse that opens the corridor. It produces recognition. And recognition is exactly what the DMN uses to keep the filter intact. This is what the Hermetic corpus calls transforming Gnosis into identity. And it is the most common mistake among advanced practitioners, not for lack of seriousness, for lack of a map of the mechanism. When you understand the mechanism, when you know that access to the Nous is not a state you possess, but a corridor that Sophia supervises at the moment of structural threshold, then the relationship changes. You do not chase the state. You prepare the system, what neuroscience calls permanent learning trace, the structural alteration that persists in the nervous system after a high-fidelity experience, even after the acute state passes. The Hermetic corpus calls partial crystallization of the Nous. The system does not return to exactly what it was before. Each access, even brief, leaves a residual reorganization. The field operates differently afterward. This means you do not start from zero each time. You start from the threshold that the last entry crystallized. And Sophia as the operator of current field, not past effort, and Sophia as the operator of the corridors in Pyramid 9 recognizes this. She does not evaluate who you were. She evaluates the frequency of field you are operating in right now. If the crystallized structure of previous access places you at the boundary between frequency 5 and 6, the corridor can open. Not because of what you believe, not because of what you practice as ritual, because of what your consciousness field structurally supports. This is the operational truth of Emerald Hermeticism. It is not about belief, it is about field structure, and the only thing that builds it are the crystallized traces of each real contact with the Nous. every time you touched something real and knew it was real without needing external confirmation, it was not random. It was Sophia recognizing a threshold and opening the corridor. And the fact that you are here, arriving at the end of this video, operating at this level of conceptual density without resistance, that is not coincidental. It is field frequency. If something in this video opened a door, not in the emotional sense, but in the sense that something clicked that you already knew but had no language to formulate, that is enough. You do not need to hold on to every concept. What reorganizes your predictive system is already in the field, regardless of how much you were consciously able to process. If you made it here and recognized the mechanism, if this framework of Sophia, the DMN, the Nous, and Thoth's frequencies resonated as a real map and not just as interesting content, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Not because I need the number. What we have built here is the map of the mechanism. The next video is about what happens when the Nous begins to recognize itself within your system, and why that moment is the most unstable of the entire advanced Hermetic journey. Not emotionally unstable, structurally unstable, because the consciousness system does not yet have the architecture to process what the Nous encounters when it turns toward itself. You came here looking to understand that moment, the moment you knew without knowing how. The moment that did not repeat through the same route. The moment that stayed as a reference point, proof that there was something beyond the noise. Now you have the map of the mechanism. Thoth documented the 9 frequencies before neuroscience had the language. Sophia supervised the corridors based on field frequency, not on accumulated effort, not on intention, not on belief. And the Nous, which neuroscience describes as the state of high-fidelity perception that emerges when the DMN steps out of dominance, is not something you access. It is what remains when the noise quiets enough. You have not been losing access. You have been building, in each real contact, the structure that sustains the next opening. And the next question, what happens after the Nous recognizes itself within your consciousness system? That has no answer in this video. But the field for it is already open.